What was the Cold War? The Cold War was a proxy war of sorts between the USA and Soviet Russia that began shortly after World War II. This led to many famous events like the space race of the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two countries were very different already from the start. They had two different ways of living, communism and capitalism. The time at which the Cold War began has been widely argued throughout the world, but I feel it started shortly after the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Knowing that Germany's defeat was just a few months away, the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, met to discuss post-war arrangements in Yalta. It was agreed that Stalin would join the USA in the Pacific War as soon as Germany was defeated. There would be 4 zones of occupation in Germany for the 4 victors, and the most important issue that was touched on was the matter of Poland's government. It was meant to be run by the Lublin Poles, who were the communists, but had to include the London Poles, who made up the original government of Poland. In July, when the Potsdam Conference had started, many things had changed in the world. Germany had surrendered, Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman was the new President of the United States of America. Churchill had also lost the election in Britain, so Clement Attlee had replaced him. The most important thing that had changed was the government in Poland. The London Poles were invited, but when they arrived, they were arrested and they disappeared. Because of this, Truman took a very firm position with Stalin due to his betrayal of the Yalta Agreement. Eventually, there were only 2 things agreed at Potsdam. Poland would have new western borders, and the victors of the war would take reparations from their zones in defeated Germany. In March 1946, Churchill visited Missouri and made the legendary Iron Curtain speech, proclaiming the USSR's desire to expand into the rest of Europe and the danger of this happening. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, said Churchill. Unfortunately, what he said had already come to pass. The year before, in Bulgaria, the government was dominated by communists, and in November, rigged elections were held. As a result, the communists won and they abolished the Bulgarian monarchy. But Bulgaria was not the only one to be conquered by the communists. Poland, Romania and Hungary were won over by communists through rigged elections. In Czechoslovakia, however, in the year 1948, the communists used armed force to seize power because they were very afraid of losing the election. They killed the non-communist foreign minister and held rigged elections soon after to win over the rest of Czechoslovakia. When Britain stopped providing aid to the anti-communists in the Civil War in Greece, Harry Truman decided that he had to help. Hence, the Truman Doctrine was born. It was to support people who were resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. This was meant to work hand in hand with the Marshall Plan drawn up by George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, to provide aid to the devastated countries of Europe. This eventually amounted up to $13 billion. This is because the USA discovered that communism thrived under conditions of poverty, and a prosperous Europe would not be a foothold for communists. Both plans helped to enforce the US plan of containment. This was actually the way of combating the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, by containing it in Soviet Russia. In the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, and the USSR got East Germany, which contained Berlin, the capital. Berlin was split into 4 zones as well, 1 for each of the victors of the war. The British, Americans and the French realized that Germany needed to recover for the European economy to be revived. They made 3 big changes to Germany by introducing a new currency, the Deutschmark, joining the British and American zones into one zone called Bizonia, and lastly, only providing martial aid to western parts of Germany. This threatened Stalin, and as a result he cut off access to West Berlin, which was under the zones of Berlin controlled by the British, Americans and the French, under the clever guise of technical difficulties. This event was known later on as the Berlin Blockade. Stalin's plan was to starve the people of West Berlin, since there was now no possible way for them to get resources like food, water or coal, in order to force the Western powers to pull out of Berlin. The Western powers, however, were determined not to lose West Berlin to the USSR, but they could not use force without triggering an all-out war, and the final decision was that West Berlin would be supplied by air. This massive operation became known as the Berlin Airlift and lasted for the winter of 1948 to 1949. Stalin ended the blockade in 1949, but it had a major effect on the world. West Germany was formed from the French, British and American zones, and as a result, Stalin responded by forming a separate East Germany. The blockade also prompted the USA to set up a permanent military alliance with West Europe. Hence, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in April 1949, or NATO. West Germany joined in 1955, which alarmed the USSR. In response, they set up their own military alliance with other communist countries in Eastern Europe, known as the Warsaw Pact. To conclude, the Cold War can be viewed in many different ways, and this is simply my perspective of it. I hope you enjoyed this brief documentary about the Cold War.